afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Conor Carlin. I'm the immediate past president of the Society of Plastics Engineers and the current SP delegate to the United Nations INC process that we're going to discuss today. So before we start here with the questions, we're going to give a quick go around to the panelists that we're joined with today, because we've got a very global panel and a very experienced panel. Before that, though, let me just state at the outset that SPE was a bit of a latecomer to the United Nations Environmental Programme process and the INC. That said, we have a lot of SP members who are well connected to some of these other groups and other organizations in different countries, which led us to the creation of our own platform with three distinct goals related to UNEP and the INC process, and that is to promote SP's technical expertise, our global education, and our collaborative approach with that global network. And I think this roundtable is going to be a great example of what that looks like in reality. So with that, I'm going to go around with our panelists here and ask them to give a very short introduction. For those who are joining us, full bios are available on Swapcard, and I encourage you to explore more and link with our presenters there. So with that, let me just start with Hodayah and ask for your name, your organization, where you're calling from, and how many INCs you've been to.
Hi, I'm Hodayah Finman. I am the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Plastics Industry Association, based in Washington, D.C. I have been to or supervised those who have been to all of the INCs, and actually the process leading up to the INCs as well. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, let's go to Europe with Julie Pieters.
So good afternoon from my side indeed. My name is Julie. I work for European Bioplastics, and we are a trade association representing the whole value chain of bio-based, biodegradable and compostable plastics. I'm based in Brussels, and I personally have followed the INC in Busan and Geneva, but European Bioplastics is an observer with INC and UNEP since Paris, so since the second round of the treaty negotiations.
Excellent. Now let's shift our focus to Latin America with Fiorella.
Hello, good morning to all. My name is Fiorella Danjoy. I am speaking from Peru. I am regional director for an NGO called Recicla Latam. We are in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Guatemala. I have personally attended to Busan and Switzerland.
And now we'll come back to North America with Tania Ferlin.
Hi, thanks, Connor, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Tania Ferlin, Director of Sustainability Advocacy at Husky Technologies. So I'm based in Canada, but we have customers in over 140 countries all around the world, and our technology and equipment really touches the lives of billions of people around the world in food, beverage, medical, and that's why it's really important for us to be present and active as a resource to delegates throughout the INC process, which we've been involved in since INC2 in Paris, and I've personally been involved and attended the INCs since then, and so really glad to be here.
All right, excellent. Thanks everyone for that. And so as I mentioned, the SP was given observer status in time for Busan, which was INC 5.1. And it sounds like we've got good experience going back for some historical context here as well. So I'd like to start with Hodayah on this one. Given your experience, Hodayah, prior to joining Plastics Industry Association as well, can you give us an overview of how the INC process actually works, and then remind us of the catalyst for these discussions?
Sure. Well, let me take the second part of the question first. The issue of plastics and plastics in the environment had been percolating at an expert level for many years. So the first UN Environment Assembly actually took a decision to do a study and look at plastics in the environment. At the second UN Environment Assembly, which I believe was, I want to say maybe 2016. I could be wrong. The the UN member states decided to look at all of the different mechanisms for global cooperation on marine litter and marine plastic litter and microplastics, and to see what treaties or international partnerships were already established that could address this problem. Then there was the establishment of UNEP 3 in 2018 to create an ad hoc open-ended expert group, which we called the AHEG. That's a very UN acronym, which looked very specifically at the different types of, now that we had some expert information and a report on the different mechanisms, what should governments adopt or recommend to UNEA in terms of a path forward for cooperation on marine plastic litter and microplastics. Between the AHEG met many times. I was the co-head of delegation to the first meeting of that expert group process. They ended up producing a report and a chair summary that was delivered to UNEA. And at UNEA 5, they finally, governments took a decision to launch an Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or an INC, that would create some kind of new structure, a legally binding new structure for, instead of marine plastic litter and microplastics, for plastic pollution. So I think the issue has been percolating for a long time, but ahead of steam at the political level, which is really what's necessary to move from technical cooperation to something with high visibility like a new treaty. That probably happened very much later in the game. When the Canadians had the G7 presidency last, so that was about 7 years ago, and the Trudeau government put this issue very much front and center at the head of state level, and that did align with the culmination of this technical process and the UNEA resolution to establish an INC. And the work is really quite complex because the plastics are not like some of the other environmental treaties. For example, there's one of the most recent environmental treaties that was negotiated before plastics was on mercury pollution. So there you're dealing with one element. And plastics are maybe more equivalent to other more complex environmental agreements because they are so ubiquitous and found in so many different sectors. So, this process has taken us all the way through INC 1 to INC 5.2 and now potentially beyond, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about. So for those of you who are interested in UN protocols and acronyms, that's a little bit of the backstory on how we ended up here.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Hodayah. I think it's important to at least explain at the outset so people have some understanding and context for really the complexity of what it takes to bring the entire world together for this type of discussion, right? Some people might be familiar with the Basel Convention or the Stockholm Convention and these different types of mechanisms through the UN that some require consensus and some don't. But given how this played out and the nature of plastics, Julie, there was significant discussion about the scope of the treaty, right? And whether the full life cycle of plastics should be taken or if something more targeted along the lines of waste management should be taken instead. And we already have the Basel Convention, to which the US is not a party. But can you share some of your thoughts on this and perhaps the unique perspective that the bioplastic groups might have?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Conor. I think you're completely right in saying that there were some sort of two approaches around the table. And in a way, it's, I think, two approaches in science, but also to political approaches. And it was the scope of the whole treaty was, to my mind at least, used also to block advancing in the discussions. And there's two approaches. On the one hand is, as you said, the full life cycle approach, where you would have, which actually the life of plastics would be covered from production to disposal. So with measures both upstream and downstream, because there's a part of the international community that deems, and I would say it's the majority that deems that, to go against plastic pollution, you actually need the whole life cycle, because only with waste management you won't get there. And then there's another side where it's more indeed the targeted waste management approach, where it's mainly collection, recycling, and disposal of waste. And this, in a sense, a pro could be that this is easier to implement. It's probably also easier to find agreement if we only focus on waste management. But those two approaches led to some trade-offs between ambition and feasibility in a way, and also to, one can wonder if the idea was to focus so much on the scope and what we actually want in this treaty was, as I said before, kind of a tactic to delay. I think there were real concerns from both approaches because of there's pros and cons from both. But nevertheless, it led to, we were in Geneva at the end of the negotiations, still discussing, should we have any upstream measures? Should there be more emphasis on design, or should we only go into a financing mechanism and then some sort of waste management rules? From our side, we've as the bioplastics industry in Europe, we've always promoted the full life cycle of plastics approach, because we think it's both at the beginning of life and at the end of life that we can find solutions, and that we need to use all solutions to go against, or to help or to lessen plastic pollution in a way. From our side, we were both advocating for design measures, and this is then more on, for example, having more bio-based feedstock instead of fossil-based feedstock, as an example, but also waste management, where we then kind of come in with compostable applications where it makes sense, of course. That can be an alternative end-of-life route to recycling, for example, or to mechanical and chemical recycling. That's in a nutshell,
Yeah.
and I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, I think from Busan to Geneva, so from 5.1 to 5.2, at the end of 5.1, the chair's text was fairly comprehensive, right? There was a lot of specifics, despite the bracketing that was used. And again, for the members here today, that the use of brackets in UN treaty text means that specific elements haven't been fully decided. And again, one thing that I noticed, especially, is you've got hundreds of delegates in real time updating Microsoft Word documents in English in legal terms, which really kind of gives you pause to think about the level of equanimity and language abilities that's required in that. So the UN really does manage a lot of complexity. And seeing that in real time, I think, is very impressive when they were breaking it out into legal and finance and science and economics. But from that, the chair's text that we left with at the end of Busan, Tania, was pretty specific, and had seemed like it had enough teeth that was going to lead to some type of treaty, despite where people were falling out. And it looks like Tania dropped off there. And she'll jump back in. But so let's move to sort of second half of that potential question, which is going to be on the nature of recycling then, Fiorella. So as Julie talked about, there's the full life cycle, which includes the origins of the resins themselves, whether fossil or bio-based, through design for recycling, material selection, but then whether the end of life, which always is going to include recycling. So from your perspective, I mean, and there was a lot of concern about the waste management, about the recycling. From your organization's perspective, can you talk about what if you felt there was tension in the approach to recycling specifically of plastics.
Well, yes, there was a lot of tension regarding NGOs. I mean, there was a lot of concern, government, industry, and even among NGOs themselves about the influence that civil society could have in the INC process. And this was also regarding recycling, because there's a lot of data or not data, like misinformation that says that recycling is not enough, right? So there was a lot of side conversations and side information saying that this would not work. However, in Latin America, recycling does work. And it's not only the recycling in itself, but it's also the circular loops and how this supports the livelihood of the waste pickers. We have, I think, only in Peru, we have almost 200,000 waste pickers that live through the recycling channels. I mean, this is the way they succeed, and also this is the start of the recycling chain for us, like for Latin America. It is the waste picker.
Thanks, Fiorella. And Tania, you you might have heard the first half of the question. We'll come back in. So we were talking about the tension between end of life from both material selection, whether bio-based, biodegradable or not, and recyclability, right? And Husky obviously is very much involved in number one, recycling specifically. So from your perspective then, looking back over a couple of the INCs, can you tell us a little bit about from the end of Busan, when we had what looked like, fairly specific elements in a chair's text and treaty, to essentially the collapse of that. Can you talk about maybe the sort of tensions that existed from different groups to the approach of recycling specifically?
Sure, yeah. And thanks for having me join back. Sorry about that. I think some of that was covered and mentioned by Julie already. But there was certainly a lot of varying opinions on what the treaty should focus on and how do we stop plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. And recycling and waste management infrastructure, I think, while it was seen as an important piece of the puzzle by most delegations, some delegations also thought that it should also encompass the full life cycle starting from extraction. So really different positions from the High Ambition Coalition group of countries to the like-minded group. Those are kind of like the two biggest opposing positions there. But what we found in our engagement, speaking with delegates both virtually in advance of the INC meetings and then also while we were on the ground, I think there was a couple of common threads or common ground on some areas, as it relates to recycling as well. That while Julie mentioned it's not the only solution to everything, it is part of the solution. And so there was the acknowledgement from what we heard from many of the countries that we met with, that setting recycled content targets could be a positive and impactful way that we can start to increase that, increase the recycling and at least close that part of the loop. But of course, that getting those recycling rates up does require investment. And then that also ties into the topic of financing and where is the funding for improved waste management and recycling infrastructure going to come from. So there was that as another topic of that unfortunately we couldn't find agreement on.
Right. And yeah. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about again, some of the UN terminology for people, the High Ambition Coalition and some of the other segments. But before that, Tania, I mean, you guys had spent a lot of time because of Husky's approach. There's a lot of small countries and a lot of small country delegations who simply didn't have the bandwidth to deal with many of the forces of information, sources of information rather, that were coming in at them. So the term capacity building was used a lot, that we recognized in terms of having the capacity, in terms of scientific expertise. So Tania, the end of that, dealing with small countries, right? I mean, they obviously didn't have as big delegates as European Union, US, or China. You just maybe comment on how you approach them or what their experience was like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, like there were a lot of large delegations there. Japan had 49 people, China had 48, the Russian Federation had 42 people, and so on. So there were a lot of really large delegations that came with technical experts and different ministries as well, like represented. But then, as you mentioned, there were a lot of smaller delegations that maybe didn't have that robust technical expertise with them. Sometimes they did, but really limited. So what we found was helpful to those delegations was reaching out proactively and having those connections made while we were there during the INCs. Some of the smaller delegations, for example, like North Macedonia, Serbia, they had 2 people. The Republic of Moldova had 2 people there. So what, from our perspective, from Husky being a technology and equipment manufacturer, with that global perspective, we were able to meet with them and give them examples of circular economy solutions that we've witnessed are effective in those in different markets and in different realities from developing countries that may not always be the same solution as what works in the developed world. So so we had our technical expert from a chemical engineering side on site at the INCs to help them understand the facts, the implications of certain measures that they should consider, and really just give them the scientific and factual resources for them to help make informed decisions and positions that reflect the needs of their specific countries and state realities.
Yeah, so Julie and then Hodayah, not everybody could be an expert in all things, right? Which is why we have specialization. Can you talk a little bit about the delegations that might have approached you or vice versa to ask, did they have the bandwidth to ask about the specifics of bioplastics and the discussion on bio-based versus biodegradability, for example, and or where did that rank in their concerns?
Should I go first, Hodayah?
Yeah, please, you go first, and I'll sort of reframe it for Hodayah a little bit.
All right, perfect. I would say it was very heterogeneous, at least within the different delegations. I think overall in Geneva, bioplastics were not a priority. Why do I say this? And you could see this as this is shooting myself in the foot, but I say this because I think since Ottawa, so in Ottawa, there was still a lot of technical language in the draft treaty, let's say, in the chair's text. The text was around 80 pages, and there was still some language that went into the depth of the technical criteria that would distinguish, let's say, bioplastics and also the different types of bioplastics. When we came to Busan, the chair had decided to go more to a framework treaty. So we went from 80 pages to roughly 15 pages, and everything that was somewhat technical was left out. So what was then for us the priority, and that was in Busan and in Geneva the case, it was to make sure that in the future legal treaty, there is a hook for alternative plastic products to then, by the conference of the parties, so in a later stage of the international procedure, let's say, come with the technical definitions and criteria, talk about uptake of these products, talking about what are the sustainability criteria, the conditions, and so forth. So in a way, when I arrived in Busan and in Geneva, my main goal was to make sure that this legal hook is in. And this was already a fight as such, and then also bring awareness towards the delegations. Because as you said, like some delegations were very big, had experts on the ground, some were not at all. And I think overall, when it came to real technical knowledge within the delegations, those experts stayed often behind. So it was not always the one that was the best technically, let's say, informed that was negotiating, because it's a political process, nevertheless. But I think for us, we were really there to make sure that there's awareness about the fact that there are alternative solutions, and to make sure also that, you know, the international community, if plastics pollution would be able to be solved in, let's say, a year, we would have already solved it. This is a process that will take a long time, and this is a process where we have multiple actors in a very complex value chain. So you need to have all actors in the value chain around the table, and you need also to have enough scientific input and enough knowledge of the value chain to be able to design rules that work at a global level, but then that where we also kind of in each region of the world go forward, you know. So our, to my mind, the level of knowledge on bioplastics within the delegations was very diverse. If you would speak to the Italian delegation, for example, it was very good, because in Italy there's a real market for bioplastics and mainly for compostable plastics. To Japan, to Korea, to Brazil, to China, you know, it's the lead markets, or let's say those regions in the world where bioplastics today are already promoted at a legislative role. They were quite well aware of them. But of course, if I would speak to, and I don't want to seem condescending, but if I would speak to a developed or to a developing country where there is not even a waste infrastructure present in the country, then for me to come in talking about bioplastics, this is probably a step too far. So there's also the reality of waste infrastructure in the different countries. And I think as stakeholders in these discussions, it's really important to understand the differences of development, but also the differences of you know, practices on the ground. Fiorella was talking about waste pickers and the importance of waste pickers, and they need to also find their place in this treaty. I went a bit overboard, but I hope I responded.
That's fine. I mean, and you bring up a couple of good points. And again, you know, you're trying to synthesize a lot of this for people who weren't there and put it in terms that are going to be relevant for SPE members in particular is what we're trying to do here a little bit, because we all sort of look through things with our own lenses, right? And so when you have a bioplastic lens, for example, or a recycling lens, that it seems like that's all you see, or that's all that matters. But Hodayah, I mean, this is both a diplomatic treaty, it's a scientific treaty, or it was attempted to be, right? Can you talk a little bit more about the expert groups, like those ad hoc expert groups that met in between? I think the last one I remember seeing was in Bangkok, and the US had a significant presence there. I think at least 24 people, mostly from EPA and NIST background. So it seemed that they were maybe more heavy on policy than scientific expertise. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but can you talk a little bit about how how difficult it was to try and find that balance, even for the bigger groups, between like the policy and diplomacy versus the science and technology basis?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that both you and Julia have made. The people who are going to these meetings are usually more in the diplomatic track. And in fact, in many countries, they come from foreign ministries as opposed to environment ministries. So what they're doing is carrying a national position that reflects maybe internal discussions within their governments and trying to come up with a framework. And I think there was a reason why the chair's text evolved over time and became less technical. A few things. One, this issue is already very broad, right? So trying to nail down a lot of technical criteria in the INC itself might mean that the INC would never conclude, right? Because it's just the volume of material they have to negotiate. So there's a line you have to draw between setting up the instrument itself and then deferring certain issues to the Conference of Parties, which is the regular meetings of the treaty once it takes effect. So, if you're thinking about it from a national perspective, right now they're developing the draft law, if you will, right? And then there's going to be an implementation phase, and that's when the Conference of Parties, that's the implementation phase. So a lot of the technical discussions, may be more appropriate in the latter part, the implementation part, because through proposals that are brought forth, countries are able to focus a little bit more and also get specific input on specific proposals. Most of these multilateral environmental agreements tend to operate that way. You can bring forward an amendment, countries have time to consider it and come back with the technical guidance as well as the maybe political guidance. So I think that that's, one complexity. The other issue here is it's not just the complexity of the issue, but I alluded to this before, and so some of the other speakers, it's how extensive the issue is, right? So when we had the Stockholm Convention that governs persistent organic pollutants, POPs, the initial discussion was around, and the initial treaty was around, quote, the dirty dozen, right? So it was 12 POPs. And right now we're talking, I think if you ask 10 delegates for a list of what we're working on, you would get 10 different answers. And so it comes back to the scope. So the scope continues to be a really challenging part of this conversation. A lot of this discussion originated in the marine plastic environment of that problem. So keeping plastic out of the marine environment. And then the question of things like production caps, things like that came up in INC, but not even at the INC 1, right? So in the middle of INC, in the middle of that process. And so I think countries are really struggling, whether you're a big delegation or a small delegation, to figure out who the right experts are to bring into their discussions. I think we're starting to see a lot of trade concerns come up, and finance concerns and economic development concerns come up. So I think the mark keeps moving, the discussion keeps moving because it's very dynamic, and the issue is very much top of mind. So that's I think another complexity. Even large delegations are not really fitted out with all of the expertise that they need. And small delegations have to they usually work together collaboratively in blocks so that they can provide coverage of the different contact groups. But they may have very different national circumstances, which is why technical assistance provided by Husky might be quite important. So Ghana understands their solutions and how they might differ from solutions in Vietnam. I will just, if I may, take a moment to highlight a piece of technical assistance that the industry brought to INC 5.2. It's a database. It's highly technical on chemical additives in plastics. And I think that is going to be a hugely useful tool for the people who are really deep experts on what might be in a plastic product or material. But and there were a number of people interested at the meeting at INC 5.2. But in terms of how many delegates were really able to absorb that information, probably very few. But again, this is something that demonstrates here's a technical tool. Maybe we can showcase it to you now so you get a sense of how, that it exists. But people aren't going to really start using it until much further down in the process, maybe even into the COP phase, right? So let me just stop there.
No, I'm glad you mentioned Stockholm. I was going to ask, bring that up as well, because again, it's a great example of scope, because there was quite a bit of discussion that I recall of the pushback on including things like additives and plastics, the composition of different plastics, in addition to plastics product design, intentionally added or otherwise, or workhorse additives. And some of these, I think legitimately people could say that they were covered in Stockholm, in the Stockholm Convention. And so bringing them into a potential plastics treaty was going to be problematic, and you're basically guaranteed failure at that point if there was such strong pushback against it, because people believed it was covered elsewhere. But Tania, PET, is an area of focus for you guys, and it is known to be recycled in much higher quantities. It is the most tangible proof, I suppose, that many people, maybe non-SP members or non-organic chemists for sure, will associate with the proliferation of plastics in general. But when we look at the U.S. Plastics Pact and the list of problematic plastics parts, and we look at some of the product design and some of the simplification, including in material selection, can you talk a little bit about how Husky has viewed this? I mean, Husky is very big on education. On that, you talk a little bit about how view through the lens of PET, what that means for maybe reducing the complexity in both the treaty and maybe even in material selection.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Connor. So from Husky's perspective, we try to encourage our customers to consider using recyclable plastic polymers, such as PET, as you mentioned, and really looking at the package or the product design as an important element for recyclability and circularity. And so just an example, at Husky, we have a PET package that has a PET cap as well as the bottle. So full mono material. I think SP members may appreciate the innovation and engineering that went into designing that. That's just an example of a solution that exists there, that I was showing that as an example to countries when I was speaking with state delegates, and they said, wow, that's really interesting. It's a concrete example of designing for circularity. Now, while this is a great example of that, and PET is the most recycled type of plastic in the world, this is also, ironically, also used as the icon for plastic pollution. Just look at all of the art displays that you may have seen in previous INCs, or in any image that is used to represent plastic pollution, which is unfortunate because it's such a recyclable plastic product. But I just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about, if I may, the broader picture of why designing for circularity is important, an important solution. Because looking at all of the elements that are being considered to be included in the treaty, we've been having conversations with delegates and highlighting that it really, before moving forward, we should consider three main things. One, is there positive environmental impact with whatever measure is being proposed? So is it addressing the solution, or sorry, is it addressing the problem with a solution? Are we making a positive difference? And ensuring that we're avoiding unintended consequences of measures that may do more harm than good. So number one, is it actually moving the needle on the environment, on the positive environmental impact? Number two, we cannot sacrifice safety or security that plastic products often provide. So plastics preserve and protect our food, our medicine, water, enable access to essential goods. We cannot sacrifice that safety and security that plastics provide. So balancing the environmental impact with the essential role that they play. And then third, we really have to look at ensuring that any of those measures do not increase the economic burden on people. And people, that includes everyone around the world, all the families from the developed world, from the developing world, especially, who are seeking a better life. And plastics often provide economic access to essential goods that these families rely on. So we really, those three things, balancing those three things, it's not an easy task, but that's why we give the example of the PET bottle as a way that we can have the positive environmental impact once we have the recycling in place to bring these bottles back, which in many cases they do. Germany, for example, 98% recycling rate of this PET bottle. Balance the environmental impact with the safety, security, and access to essential goods while not having a negative impact on the families that need to afford those essential goods.
So it moves to some of the questions that are coming in here, and maybe Fiorella, you can help me with this first one in terms of scale. And I think you can see these questions too here on the discussion. But its scale is required for recycling, as is the ability to uptake and reuse the recyclate in the location where it was generated. And was that part of the discussion during the treaty discussions? Now, this is also in the context of China's the fence program that's been in effect for a couple of years, as is the Basel Convention, and regulating international trade of hazardous waste, including certain types of recycled plastics. So those things do exist already. What does that mean? Fiorella, can you give us a little bit of your perspective then on recycling and local markets?
Yes, well, the recycling is not the same in all markets, right? It is very developed in Europe. However, in Latin America, it is not developed. We have very informal recycling chains. So that's really an issue for us, because you can see that I will put Peru as an example. Peru has a recycling rate of 2.12% of all the waste generated. But when you speak with the industry, like plastic, like any industry, like any recycling industry, you will change your perspective, and you will see that actually Peru has a 20% of recycling rate. Why is there a difference that it's so big? Because that 18% is recycled by an informal chain. We have both a formal chain and an informal chain that end selling the plastic to the industry at a very high price that was paid to the waste picker, because it passes through 2, 3, sometimes 4 small operators that finally sell this to the big company that will actually recycle the material. So this informal chain makes the material for us really expensive. So even if we want to recycle everything, we're not, and the companies that are in Peru and also the companies that come from other countries want to use recycled material in their packaging, for example, they're not able to, because their prices are not competitive. It is actually cheaper to use virgin material against recycled material. And the reason is the informal chain. So this is something very important that has never been discussed in any INC, because the perspective of recycling as a global thing is only seen as the markets that have a recycling chain that works.
I mean, I think that's abundantly clear to anybody that pays attention to this, right? I mean, like the value, the economic value is very different in different regions of the world. And one of the things I felt was sort of positive towards the end of Busan was the potential emergence of national plans, right? In order to get something at a global framework, allowing individual countries or regions to build their own plans really seemed to make a lot of sense, because it's just not equal in many different parts of the world, including the infrastructure, as we know, for the island-based archipelago countries like Indonesia, but just also the cost of energy, cost of labor. These are very, very different and very dynamic. again, look at some of these questions here. Let's go to one that touches a little bit on bio-based materials, Julie, and jump back into yours. I mean, there was talk about production caps. There was some very clear pushback from groups that you would expect to push back. People that have strong petrochemical industries, jobs and economics are at risk there too. These are valid concerns in the context of from which those countries view things. But if that was ever to happen, do you think that the bioplastics industry would be ready to take up that slack? I mean, cost and scale are two big challenges facing bioplastics. So maybe can you talk a little bit about the ability to substitute one for one on a polymer basis, and then maybe talk a little bit about the future economic impacts?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. The region I know best is Europe. I represent the European Association, and our biggest hurdle today is not research and development. It's not R&D. It's bringing it to the market, and it's finding a place in the market for bio-based products. Because as you said, the biggest hurdle today stays the cost of the material, of the feedstock that is being used to make your end product. We think, at least at a European level, that the legislator should help our industry if we want to really defossilize in getting a larger market share. Because today, bioplastics represent around 1% of the total plastics put out on the market, and bio-based is 0.5% approximately. And so at European level, we are pushing for targets in certain material applications, packaging, automotive sector, potentially also textiles and construction, to have bio-based targets, because the technologies are there. It's a question of bringing it to the market and I think the demand is also there, but this demand needs to be pushed, and there needs to be a level playing field with fossil. Do I think this would be possible at a UN level? Specific targets with kind of the like-minded and the oil-producing countries statements they made during the INCs. I think specific targets for bio-based feedstock would be going too far, probably, although we would, of course, be in favor of that. But I do believe that you can incentivize certain materials through legislation, through best practices, and I think our sector would be ready, at least in certain parts of the world, to have a bigger and a larger market share. And to my mind, if we as a society want to defossilize, and again, there can be debate on this, of course, if we want to defossilize in some way, then I think we will need the help from a legislator. In Europe, we are looking, of course, to the European Commission, but internationally, this would be UNEP, of course. I think we would be ready. Do I think the world is ready for this? Probably not yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even decarbonization of the chemicals industry, is a very fraught discussion, right? I mean, it's quite difficult. Some people are just philosophically opposed to it as well. But Hodayah, again, sort of going back to the folding in this question here from Steve Tolokan, in terms of mandating, so there's nobody from APR here, Association of Plastics Recyclers, although some of us are probably familiar with them. A big, and the European Recycling Group are also very vocal about this, right? It's a very fraught time for them economically because they can't get enough material. And one of the topics that we had talked about SP at one of the precursors to the INC treaty discussion was what it would take to actually mandate minimum recycled contents, like a certain percent, 25% minimum recycled content required in certain areas. And one of the points that we made as SP was that design really has to come into consideration here, because 100% virgin may not perform the same as a 25% PCR or PIR material for that matter. So Hodayah, maybe then you talk a little bit about sustainable levels of plastics production, and whether or not that would be mitigated in the minds of some by the inclusion or promotion of recycled content and bioplastics?
No, I think that's a really good question. The idea of using increased recyclability as a tool to get to circularity, which I think is where everybody wants to go. What are the policy tools to get there? And that's going to probably differ a little bit from country to country, which, going back to your point, Colin, I think is one of the reasons why it's important to have a national plan as part of as a provision of this global instrument. In the United States, whether or not that's minimum recycled content or not would end up being something that our Congress would have to decide if it were a binding or a legal obligation. Right now, there is no nationwide law to that effect. We are starting to see a lot of activity at the subnational level, so sort of our state level, around some of these policy measures that would stimulate or maybe provide more incentives towards some of these measures or rules that approaches that you're talking about. And we're going to see how they play out. I think they're very new, so we'll have to see what's working, what's not working, and really work with our members to understand the impacts. So we're really at a frontier when it comes to some of these policy measures, and then whether or not some constituencies would be satisfied that these are sufficient instead of a production cap or defining sustainable consumption and production. That I don't know. That's a political question. I do think it's going to be very hard to identify what is a sustainable level of production and consumption. The discussions have really been around in the INC process around auditory or ambitions, more like goals, but they're not really based. People are having a lot of trouble sort of defining what is the scientific basis or the market basis for coming up with that number or those numbers that have been talked about. And coming back to the point of wanting to make sure we're being responsible in the actions that we're promoting, it's a very nerve-wracking proposition, right? To think about tying a number to whether it's recycled content or another aspect like production or consumption, right? How much plastic resin a country imports, or how much plastic products a country might import. All of those discussions, from my perspective, those seem like things that we would want to be very sure of before we formed an opinion. So I think the parties have a lot of work ahead of them, and I do think that there are certain countries that even on a auditory or non-binding basis, they are not going to agree to a production cap, and I think there are certain countries that think a production cap is the answer. So I don't know how you make those two, how you square the circle on those two different points of view. But that is one of the jobs that those government delegates have.
I think that's a great example of the paradox, right? I mean, this is when you look at what are we solving for in terms of GHG emissions, for example, versus waste management. Viewed through the waste management lens, you have to turn off the tap in order to clean up what's already there, right? I mean, I think this is an analogy that we see a lot with people, as the bathtub is overflowing and you're continuing to mop up, you're never going to stop the spills, right? So I think that there's some legitimacy to that. But a question has come in here in terms of, again, getting agreement on certain things. We can't agree on much, it seems, these days. But I don't recall see in this, and maybe others did, but was there any discussion or momentum to form a group similar to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Was there any discussion of forming a group for authoritative consensus on the science regarding plastics waste? I don't recall any discussion, but maybe others do. So, Fiorella or Tania, do you guys want to comment on whether or not you saw anything about a push for a body to focus on the science of plastics waste?
No, I haven't. I don't recall seeing one. There was actually a meeting yesterday that was that looked into seeing more conversations for a treaty. This meeting was called by Norway and Kenya. So we should probably have some news, but I think that this will request to continue conversations from INC. I don't know if it will be INC 6 or like start over, but that's the only thing that I like not recall, but that I see is happening now.
Okay. Tanya, did you ever hear any discussions of that, of like trying to develop an international body that would be authorized or certified to comment on that?
I haven't heard of anything, and I think that's something that still remains unclear, including what's next for, I know the title of the session today is what's next, but I think we still have a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty around that. And Conor, if I may, I just wanted to circle back on that comment you made about turning off the tap. That just stood out to me because I know that's been an argument and a topic that's come up throughout the INC. Maybe in the middle of it started, like Hodayah mentioned, but just on that point, I think starting with that implies that we need to shift away from the use of plastics and the full stop, which I think is a dangerous position because, as I mentioned earlier, plastics provide essential, affordable access to things that families rely on every day.
I'm not Tanya's frozen there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I may, and this again, it's one of the complexities. So we have this INC process on plastics, but it is not the only piece of the multilateral environmental agreement puzzle. So, for example, there is a science policy panel focused on the sound management of chemicals and waste to prevent pollution that came out of the Global Chemicals Framework discussions, which is a non-binding UN process. And, they are supposed to be providing scientific and technical expertise on chemicals and waste. So, do we want to be creating something that might be a duplication of that effort in the INC process? And if so, how much more time do we need to allocate towards that? Right. So I think there are bodies within the UN space that may be dealing with some of these issues that folks are flagging. But it's yet another example of how much you have to step back to look at the big picture and step forward to look at the minor, very specific details in this process and why plastics is such a unique challenge for us to get a global consensus around.
Absolutely, and maybe Tanya will go on and sure she can hear us as we come back in here. I mean, it was a bit of a loaded question on my part, or the comment itself, because to be really blunt about it, the title of this INC was Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastics Pollution, including in the marine environment. And if you think about specifically pollution in the marine environment, the vast majority is discarded fishing gear. This was not discussed at all, to my recollection. There was some debate about whether or not it even should be included in the text prior to Busan. But maybe those who were there a little bit longer have heard maybe it was bubbling under the surface. Maybe it was, kept out. It seems like a big miss that should have been maybe an easy thing to agree on, that if there's pollution in the marine environment made of plastics, then there should be a fairly tangible way to deal with that. But it wasn't included, and it wasn't a point of discussion. So again, we weren't there for the whole thing. Maybe it was discussed, but Julie, did you hear that come up? Was that discussed?
Not necessarily, because I think once they went into this framework agreement idea, they also stepped a little bit away from the specific environment. And to my mind, at least, it was also used as within the discussion of the scope, kind of to dilute even more, not dilute, but kind of to make this discussion even more complex without it actually kind of, I think the choice was made to have a holistic approach that went beyond kind of the marine environment, and more a systematic approach. And that's probably why there was, in the end, not that much talk about indeed the specifics of but I think they used also the oceans because it's the most visible and tangible polluting place of plastics. In a way,
yeah.
It's also what we always see.
Right. I mean, how many Photoshop turtles do we need to see? And now with AI generated artwork, I mean, there's just a massive proliferation of this, and that seems to set in many people's minds the issue. But if that was, if that is what's in people's mind, that strong emotive issue, for it not to be discussed specifically in the treaty, I think was a strange miss, to be generous about it.
I can provide some background on that. I mean, there have been discussions about abandoned and lost fishing gear, for example, which is an example of marine plastic pollution, sea-based plastic pollution. There are also other bodies that are looking at plastics in the ocean specifically. For example, the IMO is looking at resin loss in ocean transport. So, but the discussion between the governments has been, how do we prevent pollution, plastic pollution generated on land from entering the marine environment? Because that was sort of zeroed in on as the major part of the problem that the treaty was going to try to solve. So all of the aspects around waste management were really targeted at preventing plastic from entering the environment and becoming pollution, and specifically going from land-based into the marine environment. So it's implicit in many aspects of the convention, actually.
Yeah, no, that's a good distinction. And stopping plastics entering the marine environment from terrestrial sources would be equally true for non-plastic sources, right? Whether something's made of any type of material or any type of household waste, plastic or not, it's a pollutant in marine waterways. Tania, I don't know if you were able to hear, you were cut off mid-sentence, but we were sort of coming back to support a little bit of your approach on it, in terms of, as we mentioned, turning off the tap, but not necessarily specifically for plastics, and then talking about the impact of the marine environment, whether seaborne fishing gear or terrestrial plastics making it to the marine environment. But let me give you the opportunity to finish your thought there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I made my point that we should just consider the impacts on critical sectors like healthcare, food security, emergency response, disaster relief, as well as just everyday use of plastics. So just considering the impacts there when talking about production caps. So I think that was just the point that I wanted to make there. So thank you.
No, it's ironic on a little bit, right? Because that's just, theoretically, if a production cap came into place, it would certainly force a lot more collection of recycled materials to keep it in play in order to fulfill the demand that probably wouldn't go down as a result of a production cap. Right. So
I don't know, Connor. I may disagree with you a little bit on that. I think the full impact of a global target for a cap would be like, we don't actually know for sure if that would be the result. I think it remains unclear, and it could disrupt global supply chains that enable essential goods, because it may, instead of what you're saying, increase recycle. Like, we want more recycled material. Brands want their material back to be recycled in the space of plastic packaging. However, like, I think we need to consider that it may shift. It may cause a shift in moving away from a plastic, using plastic, to another material entirely. And so that direct correlation between assuming that a production cap would automatically increase use of recycled material, I think some people would disagree with that. And I would invite even Fiorella to speak on that, because like, waste pickers make their livelihoods from collecting this valuable material, which is plastic, among other materials as well. But I just think like the repercussions are a little bit wider and even unknown.
Yes. So for Latin America, thank you, Tania, for this very good discussion. For Latin America, we had a survey, and 60% of the income of the waste pickers comes from plastic. So just to disappear, like to ban plastic or to put a cap on it, would really affect their livelihood. And there has not been any discussion on how there would be like a just transition for these people, and not only waste pickers, like formal or informal waste pickers. Like, there's a lot of communities that live through plastic, that are created. The ecosystems in which they move around is through plastic. So there hasn't been any discussions about this, and I think that the INC, like the waste pickers, had a voice. I think just since INC 3 maybe. I'm not sure, but they were not considered since the start, and this should have been as a discussion, because not only plastics and not only recycling, but there has three impacts. There has social, economic, and environmental impact. So, and the social impact should not be overseen. So this is one of the things that we try to put on the table, like in the INC. Our NGO is not against plastic. I mean, we promote circularity. That's what we do. So we had a lot of side conversations in which we brought data, we brought like a lot of information, actually from the like concrete data, showing how plastic can remain in safe circular loops, and how this supports jobs and the livelihoods of the waste pickers. So this gave us a lot of trust from the delegations, because we were talking about concrete information in Latin America. It's not that simple as just to put a ban or a cap.
Yeah, I mean, that's the perspective of different people from different parts of the world. What is the lowest common denominator that would be acceptable as part of the basis for any future treaty, I think is something that everybody struggled with. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. I want to make sure I answer this last question that we have, and then I'll have a final parting question for the panel. Does anybody want to share views on the role that third-party certification bodies play in ensuring compliance with domestic laws? So Julie, maybe start with you. And Europeans are pretty good at writing laws in Brussels. For third-party certification in terms of plastics, maybe give us a little bit of your perspective on how that's working specifically for bioplastics.
Yeah, sure. It's maybe not necessarily linked to this exact discussion, but there is mainly voluntary third-party certification in Europe, which controls if certain standards, either harmonized or national standards, are being abided to. And one of the certification bodies, or for example, one would be when you come to industrial compostability, there's a harmonized EU standard, which is EN 13432. And then you often, we work as European Bioplastics with 2 certifiers who have then a logo, a seedling, and then if they verify if all the criteria are being abided, then they provide the logo, and then you can say this is industrial compostable. For us, it's very important that there is third-party certification. It's key to our sector because we would have fake compostables on the market, for example, or for us, it's mainly third-party certification bodies, and certification and labeling and standardization is to make sure that there is some sort of market control. But in Europe, most of the standards that are out there when it comes to bioplastics are still either not harmonized, with the exception of the industrial compostability, but are still voluntary, and so it's also voluntary certification. When it comes, Europe is looking more and more into harmonized labeling, and then we will need to have some sort of certifiers that look into that harmonized standard and then provide certificates. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in Hodayah, I mean, in North America, obviously, I mean, you know, we'll just talk about.
Oh yeah, no, I sorry, I just see the question back in the live discussion. Of course, third parties in Europe are developing standards to ensure compliance with the packaging and packaging waste regulation and the SUPD. That's clear. But for example, when it comes to the packaging and packaging waste regulation, we are still waiting for the design for recycling criteria. And then later on, this will then be controlled. But yeah, certification bodies are very, very important. But I think in this discussion, it's a little bit less relevant because we first need to decide on the common, let's say, legislative framework or the common legal framework before we can go into compliance and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, because they're again, those compliance regimes are different in different parts of the world. North America is different from Europe, it's different from China, and they're not necessarily harmonized even within. And we have 50 states, and we're unlikely to agree on those standards, given some of the challenges that we have with EPR, even here in the US. So I want to thank everybody for your time here. I mean, we could talk about this all day and speculate endlessly. And for those of us that will be at the K show in Dusseldorf, maybe we'll have an opportunity to continue the conversation. But let me go around once more, which is the final question, and it's a 2-part question. One, maybe 2.5 or 3, but do you think there will be a 5.3? If so, where is it going to be held, and what is the likely outcome this time around? So let's start with Fiorella.
I don't know if it would be called 5.3, but I do think that there will be a next conversation. And I don't think there will be a positive impact, like a positive result, like there would be a treaty, if there is no funding from the countries. I mean, the last time, the countries that were like really pushing an ambitious treaty were Latin American countries, but like for instance Colombia, Chile, Peru, among others, like from other parts of the world. They're developed countries. They're countries in development, so we do not have the funding to make any of the things that a treaty would consider you to do, like as a country. So I remember that I think it was the last day or maybe the day before the last day that they were saying that European Union said that there would be no funding. So immediately, like Latin American countries said, well, we can't sign something that does not have funding. So besides the discussion over plastics, over caps, over life cycle, like all like that the plastic discussion, there is a very important discussion that is the funding. And I think that if the treaty does not move forward, this would be a very good reason.
Okay. Tania?
Yeah, so 2 things. One, while I don't know, I haven't heard if there will be another session. I do want to make the point that we hope, if there is one, that countries can align on some common ground to get a treaty, because industry wants an effective treaty to end plastic pollution. Like, we are all for that. So while I don't know, we are hopeful and hope that the discussions are more productive. And I just want to say, Conor, thank you for allowing the space for this discussion and for this healthy sharing of ideas, because we need to continue having all stakeholders being part of the discussion and being that resource for delegates. So thank you so much for having this space and this discussion for us all. And one last point, I just want to say how it's awesome that we have a all-women panel.
I'm glad you have the space to be able to say that. I wasn't going to draw attention to it, but there we go. Julie, final comments on potential next steps and potential location?
Well, I think this is purely speculative and personal. I think there needs to be a next step because the session was just procedurally not closed. So there needs to be something that happens afterwards. I think if there's a 5.3, that there's a big chance that it's in Nairobi. Again, that's at the headquarters of UNEP. Unless there's, once again, like Switzerland, a country that will finance or co-finance part of the INC 5.3. I think they will take some time between now and this next session, because I think it became clear in Geneva that the 6 months, approximately 6 months between Busan and Geneva might not have been enough time. And I also think we'll get some more indications at UNEA in December. So I would leave it at that.
Thank you.
And also thanks from my side for inviting European Bioplastics and for the discussion.
And over to you, Hodayah.
Well, I think that there is a lot of desire to have an agreement from all quarters. I can tell you that the industry, we want to see this global agreement succeed. We want to keep plastic out of places where it doesn't belong. We don't want plastic pollution going into the environment. And, we want to see effective waste management. We want to see circularity. We want to see recycling. We want to see all of those things. I think in terms of whether there's a 5.3, the governments that are involved have a lot invested already in this process. So they may want to still give it another try. I don't know. Procedurally, we are set up to have a 5.3. That is definitely a possibility. But whether or not they will or they can, I think it's going to be extremely important that there be a lot of informal diplomacy before 5.3 so that parties can figure out, not parties, but governments can figure out what is a potential landing zone. Again, how to square that circle, because there are some diametrically opposed views around whether or not production cap should be part of this discussion. Is this supposed to look like a Stockholm Convention, chemicals treaty, or is it, what is the scope essentially? So until that way forward is identified, 5.3 would probably look a lot like a 5.2, maybe a little more progressed, but I think people want to see some big steps, and that means a lot of spade work between now and 5.3. And I agree, Nairobi is a very likely candidate, as are Bangkok is another UN facility that is available to UNEP for large meetings. But we'll see. But if anybody on this conference call gets wind of a date and time, please share so we can plan our lives in advance. I think it's been
cloudy with a chance of ambiguity, to say the least. Well, again, thanks everybody for this. And I do think that ambiguity is something that is very difficult for people to be comfortable with, right? And I would say, maybe risking speaking on behalf of some of the SP members and some of the conversations I've seen, engineers in general like to solve problems, right? SP is very much a center for being able to do that with divisions and chapters around the world, including in Indonesia and Australia and Latin America and the Gulf countries. We very much want to encourage the other delegates to look to SP for capacity building. We are well positioned to do that, to host events and to focus on the objective polymer science portion of it to the extent that we can define where we want to be able to contribute and make sure that's available to all country delegates. We are agnostic in that sense. And we look forward to the opportunity to do that in the next time, including working with the companies and associations here. So from my side, thank you once again. Thanks everybody who joined. This will be available, I think, on our SP YouTube channel. I know we had a lot of people who registered who will probably come and look at this again afterwards, and look forward to connecting with people on LinkedIn if there's other questions. And for those who will be in Dusseldorf in 2 weeks, we'll see you there. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.